This is the Dive Into Discovery podcast, where curiosity meets insight, and every conversation uncovers a new layer of understanding.
All right, so get this. Vikings were in North America 500 years before Columbus. 500.
Crazy, right? You've been digging into Viking lore, especially their adventures in North America.
It is pretty wild.
And we're talking beyond that famous aux Meadows settlement.
Right, because there's this whole debate about whether they went further. It's exciting.
Totally. And that's what we're unpacking today. What we know, what's still a mystery, and why it all matters. So let's start with what's solid. aux Meadows. It's in Newfoundland, Canada.
Right.
Around the year 1000.
Yeah.
But why there? What made that spot so special to them?
To understand that, we got to back up a bit. Remember Eric the Red?
Oh, yeah, of course.
He was the one who set up those Viking settlements in Greenland. And those Greenland settlements, they were basically a launching pad for heading west.
Ah, so Greenland was like their Viking base camp. Makes sense.
Exactly.
And then from Greenland, boom, Leif Erikson sails in, leading expeditions to a place called Vinland. I mean, talk about your OG explorers.
He really was. But here's the thing, right? Where exactly Vinland was is still a huge debate.
It is, yeah. It adds to the mystery.
It really does. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The Norse sagas, those are our main source for all things Viking. They actually mention grapes in Vinland. But, and this is a big but, grapes don't grow in Newfoundland. So what's up with that?
It's a great question. One possibility is, well, remember the sagas mix real history with storytelling. Maybe grapes was some other berry. Cranberries, maybe? Or maybe, and this is where language gets really cool, maybe grapes meant something different back then in Old Norse.
Oh, so not a simple mistake, but like a window into how language changes over time.
Exactly. Shows how tricky it is to understand old sources.
Yeah.
Always room for new discoveries.
Always. So life in those early settlements, I imagine it was rough, no. What made the Vikings risk those crazy seas to go into the unknown? Just for kicks, or was there more to it?
Adventure was part of it, for sure. But there's more. Greenland, for example. Not exactly overflowing with resources.
Right.
Timber especially. And you need timber for ships, for building. The sagas actually say that lack of timber was a big reason they sailed west.
So they were after stuff they couldn't get enough of back home.
Exactly. Plus, think of fish, furs, all abundant in North America. It seems like, at least at first, it was less about settling down and more about grabbing those resources.
That makes a lot of sense. Which brings us to another cool part of this. Meeting the locals. The folks already in North America, the Skraelings, as the Vikings called them. What do we know about those encounters?
Even that word Skraelings is interesting. It's what the Vikings used, yeah. But today, scholars, well, they're careful about it. It probably wasn't a very nice term.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
It reminds us that history is often told by the winners,
Yeah.
and we've got to look closely at the language they used.
For sure. Words have power. So what do those sagas tell us about how Vikings and the Skraelings got along?
Well, it's a mix. Sometimes they traded peacefully, other times they fought.
Really? Why the switch? Cultural misunderstandings, fighting over the same resources.
Probably a bit of both. Think about it. You're in a new place, everything's different, the people, the customs, even how they talk. Bound to be good and bad.
Yeah, I get it. So it was like many other times in history when one group tries to set up shop in a place where other people already live.
It really is. And comparing those Viking encounters to other colonial encounters, that's fascinating stuff. On the one hand, you've got the power imbalance, right? The potential for taking advantage of others. That happened a lot of colonial times. But with the Vikings, maybe it was less about taking over and more about just getting what they needed.
Interesting, a real historical puzzle. So we know aux Meadows is the only confirmed Viking settlement in North America, but some say there are others, right?
Right, and that's what we'll talk about next. There's Baffin Island. Some think they had like seasonal camps there, but archaeologists are still arguing about what the evidence really means.
Okay, so why is that seasonal idea so important?
It tells us how they lived, how they explored. Vikings were adaptable. They knew how to deal with those rough North Atlantic conditions. They probably moved around a lot, following the resources, adjusting to the seasons.
Right, they were masters of the sea for sure, and that adaptability probably helped them a lot. But we got to talk about those wilder claims too, right? Like the Kensington runestone, that's a good one.
Oh yeah, the Kensington runestone. Found in Minnesota, supposedly left by Vikings. It shows how much we want to believe in these hidden histories, even though most experts think it's a fake.
That's a good story, though. And then you've got the Newport Tower in Rhode Island. Some folks swear it's Viking, but most think it's just colonial, from the 1600s. Why do people hold on to these myths, even when they're debunked?
I think it's because we love the idea of finding these connections to the past, like actual proof that these legendary explorers were here. It shows the power of a good story. They kind of take on a life of their own.
Yeah, we want to believe, even when the evidence says otherwise. And speaking of iffy evidence, we can't forget the Vinland map.
Oh, right. Claimed to be a real medieval map showing Viking voyages, but it turned out to be a modern fake.
Yeah, but even knowing it's a fake, it's still kind of cool, right? It makes you think about how maps, even wrong ones, can change how we see history.
Definitely. Maps are powerful. They take us to different times and places, and even when they're not totally accurate, they still show us how people back then saw the world.
Okay, so we've talked about where the Vikings went. Now, how about how they got there? Those long ships were incredible. What made them so special for these voyages?
Well, their design was amazing. They used this technique called clinker building, overlapping planks. It made a hull that was strong, but flexible, perfect for rough seas.
So built for rough seas.
And they were really maneuverable, too. They had a shallow draft, so they could go in rivers and along coasts, not just the open ocean. Plus, they used both sails and oars.
Wow, so they were fast, they could turn easily, and go pretty much anywhere. No wonder they were such good explorers. What about their metalworking? Did they bring everything they needed with them, or did they find stuff to make what they needed once they got here?
Good point. At aux Meadows, archaeologists found evidence of iron production. That's important. It means they weren't totally dependent on supplies from Greenland. They could make what they needed right there.
That's pretty impressive. And their settlements in Greenland, those lasted way longer than the ones in North America. What made Greenland work better for them?
It's complicated. Could be the climate. Maybe Greenland was just a bit easier to live in. Or maybe, over time, they learned how to use resources better in Greenland. Some even think they might have learned survival tricks from the Inuit people who were already there. It's like comparing what worked and what didn't in both places tells us a lot about how hard it is to make a new home in a tough environment.
It shows that even for expert explorers like the Vikings, it was a real challenge. So we've learned a lot about Vikings in North America. But like any good exploration, we still have some unanswered questions. What are some of the things researchers are still trying to figure out?
One thing is, well, we haven't found any Viking DNA in native North American populations. Not yet, anyway. But that doesn't mean there wasn't any mixing, cultural exchange. That kind of thing is harder to trace.
Right, even if they didn't marry and have families, they could have shared ideas, skills, stories.
Exactly. And then there's aux Meadows itself. It only lasted a few years and then they left. Why? Did they run out of resources? Did they fight too much with the Skraelings? Probably a mix of things.
It reminds us that even for Vikings, tough as they were, making a lasting settlement in North America was really, really hard.
And here's something else to think about. Europeans basically forgot all about these North American voyages for centuries. What if they hadn't? What if everyone knew about Vinland back then? Would history have gone differently?
Wow, that's a crazy thought. It just shows how events that seem small can have huge effects later on.
Yeah, it's like ripples. You throw a stone in the water and who knows how far those waves will go.
Exactly. It really makes you think. And it makes you realize the Viking story in North America, it's just one piece of this giant, complicated puzzle. But going back to those mysteries for a sec, Vinland and those grapes. What do you think about that?
Oh, man, that's one of the weirdest parts of the whole thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
We know grapes don't grow that far north, so what were they talking about?
Well, there are a few ideas. Maybe they saw some other berry that just looked like grapes to them, something that grows in North America. Or maybe the word grapes in Old Norse, back then, maybe it meant lots of different fruits, not just grapes like we think of today.
So maybe it's a mistranslation thing, or like how language changes over time.
Right. And it shows how tough, but also how cool it is to be a history detective. We're always putting together these little clues from old bits and pieces, trying to figure out what happened so long ago. And it must be hard because, those sagas, they mix real stuff with made-up stories. How much can we really trust them?
Good point. The sagas, they were for entertainment too, not just facts. And before they were written down, people just told them to each other for years, like a big game of telephone. things changed.
So got to take them with a grain of salt, right? And compare them with what archaeologists find whenever we can.
Exactly. We use all the evidence we can get to put together the most likely story, knowing we might never know everything for sure. And different people might see it differently. That's okay too.
It is. And speaking of putting things together, one thing I've always wondered about is how the Vikings ate. I mean, they were in some really harsh places. What did they live on during those North American trips?
Well, seems like it was a mix. They brought stuff with them from Greenland, but they also ate what they could find in North America.
So they stocked up their longships, but also did some foraging and hunting when they got here. What kinds of things would they have been eating?
They were really good fishermen, so lots of fish, cod especially, probably hunted caribou, seals, anything they could get their hands on.
And plants. Could they find any edible plants in North America?
Sagas mentioned berries, good source of vitamins. And maybe those grapes, whatever they really were, might have been part of their meals too.
Sounds like they were pretty resourceful, finding what they could to survive.
Oh, absolutely. They had to be adaptable to make it in those tough environments.
Makes sense. So, as we wrap up our Viking adventure, what's the one big idea you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is that history is always changing. We're finding new things all the time, which means new ways of looking at the past. The Viking story in North America is not finished yet. There's a lot more to discover.
That's what makes history so fun, right? There's always more to learn, more to wonder about.
You got it. So keep asking those questions, keep thinking for yourself, and don't be afraid to consider new ideas. There's a whole world of Viking history waiting to be explored.
Great advice. And on that note, here's something for everyone listening to think about. Imagine you're a Viking explorer setting foot in North America for the very first time. What's your biggest dream? What are you hoping to find in this new mysterious land?
Let that question be your guide as you keep learning about Vikings. Who knows what amazing things you'll discover? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
What did you think of this week's episode? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to join us next time as we dive even deeper. And as always, stay curious, because you never know what discoveries are just around the corner.